everyone. The topic of this week is project management in research, and this is a really, really important skill to be able to have, and it's one that there's not necessarily all that many spaces in the law curriculum to actually teach it. So we're looking at project management within the research process, but project management is a broader skill. It's very important across any sort of work. So a lot of the things that we talk about this week are important to whether you're in litigation, whether you're doing a research project, whether you're rolling out some kind of regulatory change proposal. There's all the same sort of skills. And this week has a lot of videos to look at, and a lot of external videos on things around planning and time time management, and also around motivation, because those things are tied very closely together. And it's not just a matter of making the time to do something, but it's using that time effectively and being able to make the most of the time that you have. Because if you're not motivated and you're not sort of ready to go when you've set that time aside, you end up wasting time, and then you get less motivated and so on. So there's a whole constellation of different things involved here, and it's quite timely in terms of the first of your assignments that's due next week. And the workshop for this week is really about building you into preparing for that submission. So there's the workshop itself has a preparatory process to go through to make sure you've got all the elements that are required, and there's also some additional appendix material on this week that will give you some ideas of the sorts of things you can put in your plan. Obviously, you can't do everything that's in those appendices, because then it'll be more than a 2-page document. But there's some ideas there, particularly when people are stuck and saying, well, what do I include, and what sort of things can I include? There's a lot of things you can include. And one of the things about this planning process is it's very hard to find a one-size-fits-all model. And a lot of the success you'll have is learning what works for you. And if you're working in a team, which you don't have to do for this project, but in reality, you'll spend up most of your time working in teams, it's about finding a model that works for everyone. And fortunately today we've got electronic tools. We're having a look at MS Teams this term as an electronic workspace. Others of you might be familiar with Slack, which is the model that Teams is kind of copied from. But there are other tools you can have to help you manage your time and manage your space as well. In the academic world, there's a lot of faith put in Gantt charts. I don't have a lot of faith in them myself, but it's important you know what they are. And those Gantt charts are these sort of sliding time planning things where you set micro objectives along the way. I'm not sure it takes you any further than having a checklist, but it works for some people. So the materials this week do introduce you to the good old Gantt chart. So when someone says, have you got a Gantt chart, you'll know what they're talking about. Okay. Apologies for the cough. It may seem strange to talk about planning and time basically a third of the way into the course, and realistically you would be doing your planning right at the very beginning of a project. However, I wanted the actual topic analysis and project definition part of the project to come first. It's really a chicken and egg problem, so as is a lot of the things, the choices in terms of what goes into the ramp and what order they go into the ramp. So it is a chicken and egg process, but it is quite difficult to plan when you don't know what you're planning for. So I thought it was important to go through those early stages of developing a topic and understanding the scope of a research project first, before we looked in depth at the actual process of developing the time plan and the time management. But ordinarily that would all happen reasonably quickly at the beginning of a project, and a lot of the ability to do that comes with time and experience and your understanding of your own working processes and the way in which you can allocate time. So one of the exercises we look at this week is the time rationing exercise, where you figure out how much time you have and how to divide it up. And most students find that's a very effective form of reality checking in understanding what time they have available for various projects. Because the tendency is often to pay attention to the project that's on your plate that has the most urgency in front of it, which is generally the assignment that's due next. The problem with this, though, is you soon run out of time for other things, and you get to the end of the term, and if you're running from deadline to deadline and just focusing on those deadlines, and you don't plan your overall time as one thing, you will run out of time for some of those key tasks that you need to do for the other projects. And the classic example of that is exams. The students spend all term, they might have, at least 4, sometimes 8 assessment tasks aside from an exam in a term, provided you're studying full time, and they spend all their time on these little mini deadlines that are all the way through because they're urgent and they're panicking, they need to get those done, and they don't set enough time to study for exams, which you don't do the week before the exam, you do all the way through. And that's about doing your background reading, making your own notes, doing the reflection on those notes, testing yourself as to how well you understand those things, performing in, say, tutorials where you prepare for a tutorial topic to see if you have enough knowledge of that topic so that at the end of term, when you come to an exam, you'll be able to perform there. Now, most of us do not set aside enough time for that. And as a result, a lot of people say, I'm terrible at exams, I can't do exams, or I do very badly in exams. And that can be for various reasons, but one of the reasons might be that it's not that you're just not good at exams, it's that you're not prepared for the exam because you've spent all the time in the term focusing on other things. And that's not really, if no one tells you about this is not something, you're expected to know. But I've spent many, many years working with students on these issues, and what is more often than not the issue of someone who really sort of does well on assignments, fails at the last hurdle in exams, is because they're spending all the time on those assignments, because they're the things that are in your ear shouting, it's this one's due in 2 weeks, this one's due next week, and then the next one's due after that. And it is very difficult to set aside appropriate amounts of time to say, I'm spending this time reading the textbook, making summaries, testing my knowledge, working through the weekly workshop tasks, which are all those things that develop your ability to deal with an exam. So one of the overall themes in this week in project management is not just about the project management time you're focusing on your research project, but it's being able to balance those other things and not letting other things get out of control or out of hand. And having the ability to say no to some tasks, to the ability to, when you're working on a research paper, to get to a point to say, that's it, I need to stop reading, I need to finish writing it up. Because yes, I could spend another 100 hours doing research, I could spend a lot more time on this, but it's a 10% of paper, it's a 20% paper. Am I really wanting to burn, a 30% exam for a 10% paper? And when the deadlines are in front of you, it can be easy to be very unrealistic and to think, I've got to get that, I've got to get it done, I'll study for the exams later, I'll find some time later. And of course, there is no later. You'll never get back that time. And it then becomes very demoralising when you get in that last gap of time before exams and you have no time to revise and you sort of trying to do it in a panic mode. Back in the day, when there were 2 terms a year, we often had sort of 2 or 3 weeks SWOT-VAC in between the last week of classes and exams, where you would have time to say, okay, I've done all my assignments now, I will sit down and I will study for those exams and revise everything for that term. But we don't have that anymore now that unis have crammed 3 terms into the year. Now, there's good things and bad things about that, but one of the bad things about it is that it often means people have not allowed enough time to study for those exams and doing that revision, making those notes all the way through the term. So there's lots of components of this week, and one of them is that sense of balance and that sense of being able to be on top of your plan and being able to be self-critical, which is a big theme And this is why we have the Matrix as a self-assessment tool in this unit, and being able to pick your own weaknesses and to really interrogate yourself on the things that you do. So are you the kind of person who says, oh, I work best under pressure? Am I the kind of person who, leaving it to the right before the deadline, I do really, really well? Because, I stay up all night and I drink lots of coffee and, that's how I get things done. That's just the way I am. And there are very few people for whom that is true. And generally speaking, that's a young person's game. The all-night study sessions and all-night last-minute crams are something that you get less and less ability to do as you get older. And work does not get less stressful. Work does not suddenly get to a point where it's like, oh, well, it's okay now. You can ease into things slowly. Now, work becomes just as frantic and just as hectic as study. So if you've got those bad habits that you've picked up from study, from trying to do everything at the last minute, and you just got through by the skin of your teeth, that's great. Don't convince yourself that that's the way you perform, because you can do much better if you've planned your time properly and actually take care of yourself health-wise. And a lot of the problems people have in terms of those, and we all know about those problems with depression and addiction and so on in the legal profession, is a lot of the roots of those problems are poor habits and poor time planning that people learn at university. They learn at the time when you can stay up all night and drink coffee and take NoDoz and get something the night before, and suddenly you hit the point in your life where your metabolism changes, or you have kids to look after, or you have all these other things where suddenly you can't do it anymore. And the last thing I'll say about that is you also, in professional life, are going to be working in teams more often than not, and you don't want to be that person in the team where everyone else has got things done and you're the one who's left it to the last minute to get it done, because you will not be a very popular person in those teams. All right, so time planning is an important skill. I'll introduce you some of the techniques this week. There's stuff in the materials, there's stuff in the readings. The reading focuses on dissertation students, on higher level students, but I think the advice there is all reasonably sound and very useful. And as usual, there's videos on this material, and particularly the Info College Geek ones from Thomas Frank. They're generally pretty good at managing time, managing stress, and all those other things. And to reinforce the point I've made it a couple of times, these are real world skills, and these tie very closely to teamwork skills. That in the real world, time management and project management is very much the core of what you will do when you work in teams. And most professions, unless you're like an author or an academic, I guess, and increasingly academic work is becoming more team-based, there are very few roles that people are willing to pay you for anyway that you can do all by yourself. And increasingly people are relying on you. So being able to manage teams is important. And there are subsets within that. There are challenges to things like managing information. When you're working by yourself on small projects, being able to just write things on bits of paper and put them in a pile can get you a certain amount of distance. But if you have to share that information with other people, if you've got to provide information in an environment where other people need to access it, that changes the whole game. So even the simple research process of finding articles and locating articles that have some importance in terms of, or authorities that are important for a particular project, being able to share that in a format where other people can access it is really important. So having cloud-based services like Google Drive, very important, very useful, and much easier than back in the day where you sort of had to make photocopies of everything you had for everyone in the group. In the same way, having shared documents, cloud-based documents, also enables you to do things like provide summaries. Imagine you're doing something like a moot and you've got sort of 30 cases that your team have to work through. The ability to divide those cases up amongst the team and have everyone, have a set of cases that they then work through and make notes on and share with everyone else. Very, very important capacity. And you can do that with those cloud-based services in a way that was almost impossible to do when you're relying on hard copies of everything. So information management's a big part of it. Leadership is another big part of it. And by leadership, I don't just mean being the boss and bossing everyone around, because leadership can come in different forms. And the role that's the organizer, that's getting people together and setting people deadlines, that is one leadership role. But so is the person who is across all the literature, who is the expert in the field, who's allocating tasks to others to saying, can you check this? Can you find this out? Can you find out more information about that? That's a form of leadership that may not be the same as the person who's trying to organise the schedules and making sure everyone has time to meet up and everyone has time to discuss something. And there's also an important role in terms of teamwork, in terms of, for want of a better word, authenticity, of making sure what the team does has integrity and moves towards the correct goals. And what I mean, that's really opposed to the phenomenon of groupthink, which is when you get a group of people together, and it's usually larger groups of people. Generally starts to happen with groups larger than sort of 7 or 8, so may not be relevant to work you do at uni, but definitely relevant to work you do in the real world. Once you get larger groups together, groups tend to work as a mob, and they tend to look to easy options and sometimes not necessarily the most credible or best options, but you can end up in a situation where someone suggests something and suddenly the mood of the group changes towards, well, let's do that, that'll be the easiest way to fix it. Now, that can be a problem in project management, and if you don't have someone who's always playing devil's advocate, who's able to be accountable and to call the group to account for things that they do, then that's another form of leadership that you will be missing. And it is often very important to have someone who says, hang on, everyone. Yeah, I know everyone agrees that we're going to go in this direction, but let's play devil's advocate for a moment. What if that's not the right way to go? What if that's the correct way to go? So that's another form of leadership that, if you're in the forefront organizer leadership role, is actually quite difficult to do. Because if you're that sort of front-run leader and you're leading the team, often you're very much getting that feedback from what the team wants. And often it can be quite irritating until you think about it, when someone turns around and says, hang on, I know we all agreed to this, but have we thought about this? It can be irritating, but it's also really, really important. And it's really important that you check those things out, because you can end up getting to the end of a project and then missing something really important because it was much easier for the group to go in a particular direction. Anyway, so those are just some of the different aspects of leadership that come out of group management, and those are things that unfortunately you don't get much of an opportunity to do at the university level. But these are the sorts of things that employers are particularly interested in graduates that can do. So some of this will also relate to what you do about your extracurriculars. If you want to make yourself really attractive as a potential employee, you've got to have those extracurriculars. And if you've been the project leader on a project of some form or another, even if it's, a group of law students who are doing a response to a law reform issues paper or a Royal Commission, and you do some research and you put it together, not for assessment, not because you're told to do it, but because you think it'll be a really good thing to do and it'll be good for your CVs, then that's something that shows those sort of capacities. It has an artifact that you can attach that is like the submission you put in, and then you can reflect on those things and say, well, actually my role in the team was to do this, and this was I managed the information section, and this is what I did to do it. So there are lots of things to think about beyond just the what do I have to do to complete a subject. And one of the things I like to do is to try and get you guys to think about that stuff before the last term, because often that's way too late, and to start thinking early on about, well, what are some of the things we can do to make ourselves stand out from the crowd? There's lots of law graduates. What can we do about that? So that's a topic I'm prepared to take up in other forums and to chat about more if you are interested in. But I like to bring it up from time to time. The other thing I wanted to mention about teamwork is that teamwork also occurs across time. And this is something lawyers are familiar with the idea of files, that quite often the people who start a project are not the people who will end a project. And one of the important parts of that sort of teamwork is the ability to set things up so you're not just sharing and working with people in your group here and now, but that when people leave the group, other people can pick it up. And yes, in legal practice, it's often that idea of the files and keeping good file notes. And people tell all sorts of horror stories about picking up a file and opening it up, and none of the documents are in there, and none of the copies of the contracts are in there, or whatever, because the person before them was slack and didn't make the file notes and didn't keep track of everything. And the same thing happens with the research project. If you end up on a really big research project like a law reform one, or even one that's within an organisation, you need to plan around the fact that some people will change jobs, some people will get promoted, some people will not, who start a project, will not be there at the end. New people will come into a project as it grows. And the ability to be able to keep good records over time is very important. But it's not something we can give you an easy template for and say, here, do this, because every project is different and those needs are different. So I just wanted you to think about the idea of time as well as synchronous collaboration, that teamwork and planning is also one of those things about the legacy of what your project is and how it gets picked up by others. All right, I've rambled on for quite a bit now. The workshop we're doing this week focuses really in on that planning process and being able to produce that quick 2-page planning document. One of which is this is the project, this is what I'm going to do, and the other is this is how I'm going to use my time, and to think really seriously about those two things as two different objectives, and there's sort of a page for each of those. And while I'm sure you're very much focused on the objective of getting the first assessment task in, this is also a transformational task that leads you on to the question of what now? What do I do now? Okay, I've got the plan, got the analysis of my problem. Now, once I've handed this in, where do I go? Particularly because it'll be a couple of weeks before the markers can return your paper to you and give you comments and that sort of thing. So it'll be a little while before those come back. I'll be giving you comments in the meantime, of course, not on people's specific papers, but on the overall situation. But you need to have that momentum going so that you move on to the next stage, that you're not waiting around or doing something else, waiting for something to happen to start getting those research sources and to start working on your project, because once you'll hand it in week 5, it's almost going to be halfway through the program, almost halfway through the legal research subject. So you need to keep it rolling and keep going. All right, I'll see you in class.